No one ever talks about the years Haruki Murakami simply vanished. Not from bookstores, of course his novels were everywhere, but from life itself. There is a period buried somewhere between his fame and his silence, a period he refuses to explain, a stretch of time that even the most devoted researchers call the blank corridor. And the strangest part is not that he disappeared, it's what happened just before he did. People remember Murakami as the quiet runner, the jazz bar owner turned literary legend, the narrator of lonely hearts wandering through surreal worlds. But few remember the night he said he saw something real, something impossible, something he later described only as the door. After that, he left Japan unexpectedly, almost abruptly, as though he were escaping something. He never provided a clear reason, only hints wrapped inside metaphors, or strange answers that raised more questions than explanations. It was as if the man who wrote about physical portals, alternate realities, and parallel selves had stepped into one himself. And then there were the real incidents, the stranger who appeared outside his home for weeks, the anonymous letters, the event at the marathon he never allowed journalists to ask about, and the unpublished material he destroyed before leaving Tokyo, pages he burned in a metal bucket on a cold morning while neighbors whispered. For years, fans speculated about the Vanishing Period as if it were one of his novels, part mystery, part heartbreak, part metaphysical riddle. And Murakami only added to the fire with the most enigmatic line he ever wrote about himself: "When the time comes, you will understand. Or maybe you won't. That's fine too." Tonight, we walk into that blank corridor, the one he never opened for anyone. Until now, Haruki Murakami did not emerge from the literary world with the thunder of a prodigy. He began quietly, almost shyly, as the owner of a small jazz bar in Kokubunji called Peter Cat. The bar was warm, dimly lit, infused with records spinning Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Bill Evans. It was a sanctuary for the young couple who worked tirelessly behind the counter, Murakami and his wife Yoko. Regulars later recalled the bar as a kind of parallel world in itself, the sort that might appear in one of his novels, a place slightly detached from the outer noise of Japan's busy streets. Late 1970s Tokyo was marked by rising urban loneliness and a shifting cultural identity. Japan was transforming rapidly, and the younger generation carried a sense of rootless anxiety. It was into this landscape that Murakami quietly wrote his first novel, Hear the Wind Sing, after a strange moment he once described vividly. He was watching a baseball game, when Dave Hilton of the Yakult Swallows hit a double. In that instant, Murakami felt something open inside him, as if a gust of wind passed through my body. It was the kind of mystical micro-event he often ran from in interviews but left hints about in essays. Something stirred that day, and a writer was born. Yet beneath his calm emergence, Japan's literary world didn't know what to do with him. Critics called his early work too Western, too smooth, too detached. Traditionalists accused him of abandoning Japanese sensibilities. Younger readers, however, felt electrified. They saw in him a new voice shaped not by nationalism or academic density, but by jazz rhythms, American novels, and the peculiar loneliness of modern life. His works began to resonate deeply across campuses and coffee shops. Soon, Murakami's world, the wells, the cats, the mysterious women, the alternate selves became cultural landmarks. By the late 1980s, he had become an international name with Norwegian Wood, a novel that sold millions and turned him into a phenomenon almost overnight. But success brought shadows. He spoke increasingly about feeling misaligned with society. He was uncomfortable with mass attention and disturbed by how intimately strangers interpreted his work. He rarely appeared in public. At readings, he avoided eye contact. His friends later confessed that fame made him restless, even fearful. A journalist once reported that Murakami asked to change interview locations at the last minute because he felt followed. Around this time, Japan itself was carrying dark wounds. The 1995 sarin gas attack by the Aum Shinrikyo cult shook the country. Murakami investigated the tragedy firsthand, interviewing survivors and former members for what later became underground. But there is something rarely mentioned. During the interviews, he encountered stories too disturbing even for him. He hinted once in an essay that he had witnessed something that should not have existed, a remark scholars debated for decades. His friends also noted unusual events emerging in his daily life. He received anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, where the caller said nothing, only breathed softly. There were letters delivered to his home that contained nothing but blank sheets. A stranger appeared repeatedly on his running routes, always a few meters behind, never speaking. Murakami dismissed these events publicly, calling them odd coincidences, but he mentioned them with unease in private. Then, at what seemed like the peak of his career, Murakami abruptly left Japan. No grand announcement, no explanation. He and his wife packed their belongings and moved to Europe, then later to the United States. He described his departure as an escape, but he never said from what. Japan's media speculated. Some said it was the overwhelming fame from Norwegian wood. Others suggested he feared being targeted after his interviews about the AUM cult. A few whispered that he was running from something more personal, grief, guilt, or a secret event he would never disclose. What is known is that this departure marked the beginning of what fans now call the Vanishing Period. Murakami went silent, almost invisible, living a nomadic life and writing obsessively. His novels during these years, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, Sputnik Sweetheart, Kafka on the Shore, became darker, stranger, more haunted by disappearances, parallel worlds, and the idea of an unseen force nudging fate. It was as if his fiction had become a coded diary. What he experienced during these years remains largely unspoken. But the rumors, the strange real-life events, and the lingering hints in his writing point to a hidden narrative, one he never intended for the public to fully uncover. Haruki Murakami's story did not escalate all at once. It drifted, slowly at first, like one of his characters wandering the outskirts of a dream. The beginning of the Vanishing Period was gentle, almost tranquil. After leaving Japan, he and his wife settled briefly in Italy. He wrote in small cafes, jogged through quiet medieval towns, and tried, as he often said, to remember how to be a person without noise around me. To anyone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like a writer simply taking a creative retreat. But beneath the calm surface, something had already shifted. The first unusual incident occurred in Rome. Murakami mentioned it only once, in an obscure interview later removed from publication, but a fragment survived in a fan-transcribed forum. He said he felt followed by a man with no expression, a figure who appeared in alleys, bookstores, even a laundromat. Murakami dismissed it as paranoia, but the detail unsettled readers. In his later novels, silent followers appear again and again. Scholars still debate whether this was coincidence or confession. The next incident happened months later in Greece, where he lived on several islands while drafting the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. One night, while running along a coastal trail, Murakami heard footsteps behind him. When he stopped, the steps stopped too. He saw no one. At his hotel, The receptionist later told him an envelope had arrived for him. Inside was a single object, a small, rusted key. No note, no explanation. Murakami burned it in the fireplace and never spoke of it again. But his next novel would revolve around a mysterious well and an unexplained key. From here, the strangeness grew. The escalation felt like the tightening of invisible threads. Letters arrived with no sender. Pages he had not yet published appeared quoted in anonymous blogs. A friend from Tokyo later revealed that Murakami privately believed someone had entered one of his temporary apartments while he was away. Nothing was stolen, but a stack of his handwritten drafts had been rearranged. Murakami's reaction was telling. He rewrote the entire section and destroyed the original. As the incidents accumulated, he began moving more frequently, as if trying to outrun something. He rarely disclosed his location. His editor often received manuscripts from unexpected addresses: a post office in Denmark, a small town in Berkeley, a nameless mailbox in Hawaii. The journalist John Ray once said that interviewing Murakami felt like speaking to someone living in the space between worlds. The climax of this unsettling period arrived during his years in the United States. It was there, while teaching at Tufts and later at Harvard, that Murakami received a package that deeply disturbed him. He never revealed its contents publicly, but his assistant mentioned that Murakami locked himself in his study for hours afterward. The next day, he cancelled all lectures for the semester. Around this time, another rumor surfaced, one with no direct confirmation but often whispered in literary circles. It concerned an incident during a long-distance run in Cambridge. According to a student who saw him that morning, Murakami suddenly stopped mid-run, stared at an empty patch of road for nearly a minute, then whispered, "Not again." When asked what had happened, he simply jogged away. The sense of internal conflict grew stronger in his writing. His novels turned darker, more fractured. Characters disappeared without explanation. Realities split. Wells, doors, tunnels, and alternate selves became recurring symbols. And in nearly every work, there was a moment where the protagonist faced something unspeakable, something the narrative approached but never fully named. These years took a toll. Murakami began isolating himself deeply, avoiding interviews and declining most literary events. When he did speak, he often used metaphors that made journalists uncomfortable. He once said, "There is a place I cannot return to, because something waits for me there." By the late 1990s, Murakami reached a breaking point. The combination of fame, secrecy, and the strange events that followed him forced him into the harshest internal confrontation of his life. Something had shifted permanently. Something he would never completely reveal. And then, as suddenly as it began, the vanishing period ended. He returned to Japan quietly, without public announcement. But he did not return as the same man. He brought with him a darkness, a private history, and a silence that even now shadows every interview he gives. The consequences of what happened during that period would echo through his work forever. What happened during Murakami's vanishing period has never been officially documented, yet the fragments he left scattered across interviews, essays, and the trembling edges of his novels reveal a truth far darker than most readers imagine. It was not only fear of fame or discomfort with public scrutiny. It was something older, something personal, and something he believed would follow him if he stayed still too long. The turning point occurred not in Europe, as many assumed, but in the United States. Murakami himself left one cryptic line in a rare talk he gave years later. "America changed me. Not because it welcomed me, but because it reminded me of something I was trying to forget." He would not elaborate, but several of his colleagues hinted at emotional turbulence behind the scenes. One professor who worked with him at Tufts recalled an evening when Murakami arrived late to a gathering, visibly shaken. He quietly told her he had received a message from the past. When she asked what that meant, Murakami smiled politely and changed the subject. But in that smile there was something fractured. The package that arrived at his Cambridge apartment the same year became a central rumor among literary insiders. Though Murakami never spoke publicly about it, a Japanese editor who briefly saw him afterwards said Murakami looked as if he had met his own ghost. The editor claimed Murakami's hands were trembling, and he burned something in the fireplace that evening. She said she heard him whisper, "I thought this was over." He refused to discuss it further. It was during this time that Murakami began experiencing the strange real-life events he later buried inside metaphors. In one interview, he admitted that several moments in the wind-up Bird Chronicle were based on actual disturbances he experienced. When pressed for details, he only responded, "Some things don't want to be named." He described hearing unexplainable sounds, having dreams that felt too real, and waking up with the sense that someone had been in the room. His wife later acknowledged that they moved apartments twice during that year because Murakami felt unsafe. These weren't hallucinations, and they weren't literary exaggerations. They were, as he later phrased it, memories trying to surface through the cracks. One of the most disturbing stories came from a close friend, a fellow author, who said Murakami confessed to him about an encounter that occurred on a bridge in Boston. He said Murakami was walking home when he suddenly saw a man standing at the other end of the bridge, staring directly at him. Murakami recognized him instantly, not as a stranger, but as someone from his past. The friend said Murakami refused to explain who the man was, only that it was impossible for him to be there. Murakami later fictionalized a similar scene in Kafka on the Shore, but he changed the setting, the character, and the emotional context. Yet the core was the same, a confrontation with a ghost from his life before fame, before writing, before he became who the world knows now. He alluded to this shadow figure in multiple essays. In one unpublished lecture, he wrote, "We spend our lives outrunning one version of ourselves. Sometimes it catches up." To many, this sounded metaphorical. But those who knew him intimately believed he meant something far more literal. During this period, Murakami also suffered severe nightmares. A roommate from his time in Cambridge mentioned that Murakami once woke up screaming, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of his bed. He could describe the silhouette perfectly: tall, still, familiar. Yet when he turned the lights on, no one was there. After that night, he slept with the door locked and the lights dimmed. The psychological toll was immense. His writing grew heavier, more emotional, more haunted by the idea of dual selves, missing people, and invisible forces. Readers saw these as literary flourishes. But Murakami later admitted, "I write to stabilize myself. If I didn't write, I would tilt in the wrong direction." By the late 1990s, the rumors had reached the Japanese press. Most of them were dismissed as fan speculation, but a few journalists caught glimpses of the truth. One wrote that Murakami returned to Japan looking as if he had walked through a storm. Another noted that he avoided questions about his past more aggressively than ever, especially anything relating to his early adulthood. Behind the scenes, Murakami's emotional state was fragile. A translator who worked with him during this period said that he once paused in the middle of a sentence, stared out the window, and whispered, "It didn't stop. It just lost my address." When she asked what he meant, he laughed and changed the subject. Upon returning to Japan, Murakami retreated from public life even further. He refused most interviews, built tall walls around his privacy, and created a routine that allowed him to stay in control: running, writing, isolation. Those who visited him said the silence in his home felt intentional, as if he had built a moat around himself. The media reacted with fascination. Some believed he had experienced a mental breakdown. Others speculated that he had been stalked, threatened, or confronted by someone from his past. Readers dissected his novels for clues. Literary critics argued about the boundaries between fact and fiction in his work. His silence only fueled the fire. But the truth remained locked inside Murakami himself. He carried it through the years like a sealed box buried beneath layers of metaphor, dream logic, and emotional camouflage. He said once, in a rare moment of honesty, "I write because it is the only way I can speak without revealing too much." And he never revealed what really happened. It is the silence, more than the rumors, that continues to echo. When we look at Haruki Murakami's life through the cracks, not the glossy surface, we begin to understand that the mystery around him is not an aesthetic choice. It is a survival mechanism. This channel has talked about many artists who hid behind metaphors, who used fiction to shield themselves from past wounds, but Murakami stands apart. His silence feels less like secrecy, and more like protection, not only of himself, but of something he believes shouldn't be disturbed. Our opinion is that the Vanishing Period was not a simple retreat from fame, not the whim of a shy writer overwhelmed by the spotlight. It was a rupture, a fracture in his life that left permanent tremors through his work. The recurring symbols: cats, wells, labyrinthine cities, absent women, ghost-like strangers are not mere literary motifs. They are emotional fossils, traces of something that shaped him so profoundly he could only speak through stories. Every novel afterward feels like another attempt to reassemble himself, to stabilize a balance the world had thrown off center. We also believe Murakami's refusal to discuss what happened as not arrogance, nor mystery building, nor indifference. It is fear, not a dramatic, cinematic fear, but the quiet, persistent kind that follows a person for decades. Readers often imagine that authors choose their symbols, but sometimes the symbols choose the author. And Murakami's symbols began choosing him at the exact moment his life grew complicated, real, and uncontrollable. This channel does not condemn him for avoiding explanations. In fact, we see a strange courage in that silence. In a world where every scandal becomes content, every confession becomes a headline, Murakami chose the opposite path. He kept a part of himself unspoken, untouched by the public, uncorrupted by interpretation. And in doing so, he showed that artists are not obligated to expose every wound. Some truths survive only by staying in the dark. At the same time, we can't ignore how deeply this secret period shaped his legacy. The novels written after his disappearance carry a different temperature. They are colder, more fragmented, more emotionally submerged. They read like maps written by someone searching for a way out of a maze only he can see. And readers, knowingly or not, are pulled into that maze with him. Perhaps that is why Murakami's audience is so devoted. They sense the real pain behind the surrealism. But here is where this channel stands. Whatever happened to him, Murakami transformed it into art. Not self-pity, not confession, but literature. The Vanishing Period could have crushed him. Instead, it reshaped him into a writer whose work feels alive in the deepest, strangest corners of human emotion. Now we turn to you. What do you think happened during those years? Do you believe the strange events were coincidences, or do you think they marked a turning point he could never fully recover from? How much of an author's life do you want to know? And is there a line between privacy and mystery that we, as readers, should respect? Your impressions matter here, because Murakami's story is not just his story anymore. It belongs partly to every reader who has ever wandered into his dreamlike corridors and felt something familiar there. And maybe, just maybe, one of you understands the silence better than any critic ever will. When we look at Haruki Murakami's life through the cracks, not the glossy surface, we begin to understand that the mystery around him is not an aesthetic choice. It is a survival mechanism. This channel has talked about many artists who hid behind metaphors, who used fiction to shield themselves from past wounds, but Murakami stands apart. His silence feels less like secrecy, and more like protection. Not only of himself, but of something he believes shouldn't be disturbed. Our opinion is that the Vanishing Period was not a simple retreat from fame, not the whim of a shy writer overwhelmed by the spotlight. It was a rupture, a fracture in his life that left permanent tremors through his work. The recurring symbols, cats, wells, labyrinthine cities, absent women, ghost-like strangers, are not mere literary motifs. They are emotional fossils, traces of something that shaped him so profoundly he could only speak through stories. Every novel afterward feels like another attempt to reassemble himself, to stabilize a balance the world had thrown off center. We also believe Murakami's refusal to discuss what happened is not arrogance, nor mystery building, nor indifference. It is fear, not a dramatic, cinematic fear, but the quiet, persistent kind that follows a person for decades. Readers often imagine that authors choose their symbols, but sometimes the symbols choose the author. And Murakami's symbols began choosing him at the exact moment his life grew complicated, real, and uncontrollable. This channel does not condemn him for avoiding explanations. In fact, we see a strange courage in that silence. In a world where every scandal becomes content, every confession becomes a headline, Murakami chose the opposite path. He kept a part of himself unspoken, untouched by the public, uncorrupted by interpretation. And in doing so, he showed that artists are not obligated to expose every wound. Some truths survive only by staying in the dark. At the same time, we can't ignore how deeply this secret period shaped his legacy. The novels written after his disappearance carry a different temperature. They are colder, more fragmented, more emotionally submerged. They read like maps written by someone searching for a way out of a maze only he can see. And readers, knowingly or not, are pulled into that maze with him. Perhaps that is why Murakami's audience is so devoted. They sense the real pain behind the surrealism. But here is where this channel stands. Whatever happened to him, Murakami transformed it into art. Not self-pity, not confession, but literature. The Vanishing Period could have crushed him. Instead, it reshaped him into a writer whose work feels alive in the deepest, strangest corners of human emotion. Now we turn to you. What do you think happened during those years? Do you believe the strange events were coincidences, or do you think they marked a turning point he could never fully recover from? How much of an author's life do you want to know? And is there a line between privacy and mystery that we, as readers, should respect? Your impressions matter here, because Murakami's story is not just his story anymore. It belongs partly to every reader who has ever wandered into his dreamlike corridors and felt something familiar there. And maybe, just maybe, one of you understands the silence better than any critic ever will. There is a quiet ache that lingers whenever we talk about Haruki Murakami's lost years, a feeling that slips between certainty and imagination. Maybe that's the only way his story was ever meant to be understood. Not as a neatly solved mystery, but as a room filled with flickering shadows, where some truths stand still just beyond the doorway. The Vanishing Period remains one of the most delicate, haunting chapters in modern literary history, not because of what we know, but because of everything he chose not to reveal. And perhaps that is the most Murakami-esque truth of all: a life filled with gaps, blank corridors, and small pockets of silence that hold more weight than any public confession. He created worlds where lost cats lead to hidden realities, where wells open into alternate dimensions, where memories become doors. And when we look closely, we can't help but wonder if those stories were less fiction and more reflections. Dim mirrors of something he lived through, alone, far from home. His return to Japan did not close the door behind him. It only softened the footsteps. He came back with quieter eyes, steadier movements, a deeper stillness. Friends said he laughed less but listened more. His writing gained new shadows. Even now, every new novel he releases carries a faint echo from that unspoken era, as if the past occasionally taps on the window, reminding him that some ghosts stay even when uninvited. And yet, Murakami never let those shadows drown him. He kept running. He kept writing. He kept moving through the world with a fragile courage that felt almost transparent. His legacy today is not only in his surreal landscapes or his hypnotic prose, but in the way he turned silence into narrative, turned fear into atmosphere, turned disappearance into creation. The mystery of his vanishing years remains suspended in the air, like a note from a jazz record just before it fades. And maybe that's where it should stay, a lingering question, a half-open door, a story we are allowed to feel, but never fully grasp. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know. And long after this video ends, long after Ember's voice falls quiet, Murakami's shadowed years will stay with you like a dream you cannot fully remember, yet cannot forget. A reminder that even the most celebrated writers carry hidden worlds inside them, worlds shaped not by fame or success but by the moments they keep secret. In the end, what remains is the legacy of a man who walked through something unseen and came out with stories the world would never stop reading. Not answers. Not explanations. Just the echo of a life lived partly in the light, partly in the dark.